Round number 3 of the Rochester Open 2022 edition. I have 2 points out of 2 so far. I'm tied for first place with 2 other players, and in this round, I'm playing Dr. OK Iwu. He's a good friend of mine. He was down half a point, so he had 1.5 out of 2. He was playing up to me in the 2-point score group. He had the white pieces, and the tough thing about playing OK is I like to play a lot of the same openings he does when I'm playing white, and he's such a solid player. I really don't like playing black against him. So he starts out with 1d4. And I decided here that I'm going to try to go for the triangle setup, which we do recommend in our Slav course. And during these recaps, I have 35% off all the chess goals courses. Link in the description, courses.chessgoals.com. Coupon code OPEN, OPEN, 35% off all of the courses, and you can preview them for free. So I'm going for a triangle setup, which we recommend in the dynamic Slav course. And here, OK plays queen to c2. This is a tricky move. In the course, we recommend grabbing this pawn and then going for a quick b5, c5. But I haven't looked at that theory in a long time, and I haven't really played any games in this line. So what I decided to do was transpose this into a typical Stonewall Dutch. I start with bishop to d6. What I'm waiting for here is I kind of want to see white commit to g3. I didn't want to play the Stonewall against something where that bishop gets outside the pawn chain and then e3 is played. So I kind of wanted to see this commitment. G3 was played, and then I went for the Stonewall. Bishop to G2, knight f6. I'm doing kind of standard Stonewall setup. Stonewall, by the way, is when these pawns are all kind of making this zigzag on light squares. It's very solid. The downside, though, is this bishop on c8 gets boxed in behind the pawns. So that's something that you always have to think about in these structures. How can that bishop get into the game later? Bishop to f4, b6. So now you can see bishop to b7, or maybe bishop to a6 could be played here. And what OK is doing is he's trading off the dark square bishop. So that's technically my good bishop. It's the opposite color of all these pawns. And technically that's the bad bishop for white. If you consider his pawns, a lot of them are on dark squares, especially this one on d4 that's fixed by this pawn on d5. So good strategic decision, trading off the bad bishop for my good bishop. But I do get the bishop on this long diagonal, and I know c5 could be coming soon. Rook c1, knight e4. So there's a definite positional struggle going on here. I have to constantly watch for this threat, c takes d4, in combination with his queen coming into c7. So white has control of the c file right now. If that c file opens up, I could be in some trouble. So playing knight e4 here, the idea is if c takes d, I take back with the e pawn. Even though this pawn's a little bit weak, my position here feels fairly solid, and this other knight can come back into the game next. So here, OK played pawn to e3. I think maybe going for f3, e4 could be a plan. I'm not really sure, though, what the best idea for white is. e3 is just super solid, though. There's nothing wrong with this move. Knight e7. So now what I'm doing is I'm not allowing knight to e5 because I have 2 defenders on this square. a3, a5. Here I felt pretty comfortable, and OK actually looked very nervous. He was sighing quite a bit. He felt a little bit stressed, I could tell. And coming up here, after rook to d1, I play pawn to h6, hinting that I'm going for this kingside attack with g5, g4. And here I offered him a draw. And this is a 60-minute time control with 30-second increment. So 30 seconds added every single move, starting at 1 hour. He had 39 minutes. I had 35. I offered him a draw here. And I could tell he really was thinking hard about it. He spent 10 minutes on his reply. And he said, let's play on a bit. Part of the reason he wanted to play on is because his good friend Dane, who's a Dutch player, would give him a hard time if he agreed to a draw. And he didn't want to lose his privileges with Dane. So he said, I got to play this on. The reason I offered the draw is because I could sense that he wasn't happy with his position. And I was in a tie for first place, a 3-way tie, and the 2 leaders were playing each other. And I could tell their game was about to head to a draw. So if I draw this game, I'm still in a tie for first place. That was kind of my logic. And I had 2 super long games, and I skipped lunch because I didn't have enough time in between those games. And I was just thinking, okay, if I could go home today with 2.5 out of 3, I was very happy with that. But he decides to play on knight to e1. Now I play bishop to a6, bringing a little bit of pressure on that c pawn, bishop to f1, and bishop back to b7. I didn't want the trade of light square bishops really, and I also had to think about tactics, like could c5 get played? Maybe my bishop is under fire, like if I had moved the rook to c8, for example. So I just brought this bishop back thinking, okay, now your bishop is off the longest diagonal. Let me put mine back on it. Pawn to f3. Now, at this moment, I really didn't think too hard about knight takes d2. I'm not sure why I didn't play it. To me, knight takes d2, looking at it now, just makes the most sense because when I bring the knight back to f6, these are what's called superfluous knights. They attack each other. They kind of get in the way of each other. And I'm just a little bit cramped here. I should have traded off one knight because then my other knight can safely just head to f6. All right, so we both bring rooks to the c file. I kind of missed this idea of pawn to c5 for white. I should have played c5 myself. But I think it's something that, in the Chicago Open, my last over the board event, one of my takeaways was that I pushed pawns too often. And now in this event, I'm overcompensating. We saw in round number 2, I should have pushed the H pawn a few times. In this case, I should have pushed the C pawn. And I was just afraid to overcommit with the pawns. Um, so now I got to think about it from both sides. It's probably going to just cause me a lot of anguish. Queen to b3, pawn to e5. So I finally get my break in. I don't want to allow white to build up in this position too much, but the best break would have been pawn to c5. And the idea is if white takes, like let's say d takes c, I can take back with the knight hitting the queen. And if white takes this way, I can take with the bishop hitting the queen. Right? So either capture kind of helps me out. White doesn't want to take either pawn. So c5 is perfectly safe to play. After pawn to e5, this does open up my king slightly. And OK plays the correct move, c takes d. Now he plays knight to d3, pressuring this pawn. And I decide to take. This is a slight advantage for white. I'm stuck with this bad bishop still, protecting the pawn. What I should have done is played pawn to e4, a little bit more aggressive, trying to point these pawns towards the white king. And let's say f takes e, I can take with the f pawn, and this bishop can come back out this way to come over to the king side. All right, so I take though, and now I'm kind of accepting this bad pawn structure, accepting a worse position. And what I decided to do here was just get very aggressive because I know that I'm probably going to get ground down and I don't have many winning chances if I just sit and sort of trade and defend. So in this position, I trade bishops and play pawn to g5, very aggressive. What I'm doing is I'm just going to go after the white king. I'm looking for moves like g4 or g4, f4, knight to e4 if this pawn moves, and I'm going to go after the black king. That's my counterplay. So knight to g6 played. I swap this pair of rooks and play rook to e8. So I have the e file, white has the c file. Queen to b5, king to g7, and now this knight is about to be captured. And OK plays very aggressively. This is a good move though. Rook to c6, best move on the board. After my queen moves, knight e5, takes, 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 queen takes b6. Now at this point, we were both looking at the position thinking black is in trouble. I was thinking I'm probably getting checkmated here or I'm going to lose some material. OK definitely felt the same way. We're at move 31 in this position. He had 14 minutes, I had 11 minutes. So kind of just starting to get to that 10-minute mark where we really start to feel the time pressure. At this moment, I played pawn to f4 and I just decided I'm going for it. I need to attack this white king. He's too safe. My king is vulnerable. Rook c7, king g6, queen a7. I was super nervous here. How do I defend against these threats on the 7th rank? And after a little bit of calculation, I found rook to g8. And all of a sudden I was like, okay, I'm actually kind of happy with rook to g8. Look at the rook sitting on the g file, and I'm going to play g4 and just try to blow open this kingside position for white. On to b4, takes, takes, and now g4. And I don't think OK saw this coming. And after the game, we both thought maybe he should play g4 here. Um, but Stockfish is saying h5 for black and the attack continues. So kind of an interesting position. All right, so b4 played in the game. Takes, g4. Rook e7. Now I play queen to b2, and all of a sudden I'm starting to get confident because I calculated out g takes f is coming, threatening mate right here. If f takes g, pawn f3, still threatening the mate. And my queen is attacking this passed pawn. So if we go back a couple moves, right here, what happens if pawn to b5, g takes f3? If this pawn tries to push, white is actually getting mated. Look at that. So that pawn never had a chance to get marching up the board because of this counterplay by playing g4. Okay, so back to the game line. Rook e7, queen b2, queen f2, offering queen trade. And here I felt pretty good. I can trade queens and actually play rook to b8, attacking this pawn. And this rook cannot defend it because my pawn guards e4. So I go for the trade those pawns, rook to b8, and now I'm up a pawn going into this endgame. And I'm starting to get flashbacks of round 1 and 2. Both of those games, I was able to get the win in the endgame. And I'm thinking the same thing here. I'm playing for the win. We're at move 39, knight e3. These trades all happen, and I give my opponent, okay, a lot of credit here. He just played extremely solid. And once we reach this rook and pawn endgame, even though I'm up a pawn, this is actually really easy to draw for white if you have good technique, and he had great technique. Um, you just use your rook to pressure this pawn, and it's really hard for black to make progress. If I try to advance this rook and pawn too far, my rook actually gets stuck back here. Meanwhile, his rook cuts off my king. And if my king tries to come help the pawn, then this h-pawn dies. So we're at move 44. I try a few tricks, just see what he would do. But really, there were no issues for white. And at this point, we shook hands, agreed to a draw. So that was round 3. I think my biggest takeaways were looking to play c5 early, um, having a good understanding of when to do that. The knight trade, instead of retreating my knight, having superfluous knights. But really, I think this was the highest level game so far of the event. Each game, I think, has gotten a little bit better for me. Round 1, I had that huge attack, completely blundered a couple blunders in a row, and was able to save it. Round 2, I was never worse. This one, I think, was an even higher quality game, though, than round 2, because I never really had a win that I missed. My opponent played really well. It was just we were holding so close to equality the whole game. So that's round 3 recap. We'll have round 4 tomorrow. Link in the description, courses.chessgoals.com. Make sure to take advantage of that 35% off during these recaps with the coupon code OPEN, OPEN. We have a Slav course that has a Stonewall Dutch prominently featured in it. I think you'll like that one. There's a lot of fun positions, and there's another Stonewall Dutch coming up in round number 5, a bit of a preview. Thanks for watching. See you in tomorrow's recap.